She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded and walked out. The door closed softly behind her. What Jim Morrison recorded that night was never released. Some say the tapes were lost. Others say they were hidden. A few believe they were destroyed intentionally because what was on them was too raw, too true, too unguarded to survive in a world that had already turned Jim Morrison into a myth he could no longer control. But the engineer who was there, a man named Claude Montand, never forgot what he heard. And decades later, in a quiet interview that almost nobody read, he said, "It wasn't a song, it was a confession, and it broke my heart." But the real story begins long before that Paris studio. It begins in a place most people never think about when they picture Jim Morrison. It begins in silence. Jim Morrison grew up in a military family. His father, George Stephen Morrison, was a Navy admiral. Discipline, order, control. The Morrison household moved constantly. Virginia, California, Florida, New Mexico, wherever the Navy sent them. Jim learned early that nothing was permanent. Not home, not safety, not identity. He learned that if you wanted to survive, you had to build something inside yourself that couldn't be taken away. For Jim, that thing was words. He started writing as a child. Not songs yet, just words, fragments, observations. Things he saw that nobody else seemed to notice. The way light changed when you stared at it too long. The way people's faces shifted when they thought no one was watching. He filled notebooks, and he kept them hidden, because in a house built on rules and expectations, there was no room for a boy who saw the world differently. There was no room for sensitivity. There was no room for poetry. By the time Jim reached high school, he'd learned to perform. Not on stage, not yet, but in life. He became the smart one, the reader, the one who could quote Nietzsche and Rimbaud and make it sound like he was joking, even though he wasn't. He learned to hide what he felt behind what he said, and that distance between the inside and the outside became the foundation of everything that would follow. In 1964, Jim enrolled at UCLA to study film. He thought maybe he could turn what he saw into images. Maybe cameras could say what his voice couldn't. But film school felt hollow. Everyone around him was learning technique, learning craft, learning how to make movies that looked like other movies. Jim wanted something else. He wanted to burn through the screen. He wanted to show people the truth underneath the surface, the chaos beneath the calm, the terror and beauty that most people spent their whole lives trying not to see. That's when he met Ray Manzarek. 1965. Venice Beach. Jim had dropped out of film school. He was living on a rooftop, surviving on acid and poetry and whatever food he could find. Ray was a keyboard player, trained, serious, looking for something that mattered. They started talking about music, about Blake, about breaking doors, about what would happen if you stopped pretending and just told the truth out loud, in front of people, with no apology. The Doors formed that year. Within 2 years, they were massive. Light My Fire became a hit. Jim Morrison became a star. But that was not the whole truth. Because while the world saw the Lizard King, the shaman in leather pants, the poet prophet on stage, the man who seemed to live without fear, Jim himself was drowning. He drank to quiet the noise. He drank to blur the line between the myth and the man. He drank because being Jim Morrison, the icon, the symbol, the thing people screamed for, was unbearable. And the more famous he became, the more impossible it was to be anything else. By 1969, the weight had become too much. The Miami concert incident, the obscenity charges, the chaos, the trial, pushed him further into isolation. He wasn't a person anymore. He was a scandal, a headline, a courtroom defendant. The poetry he'd wanted to share had become spectacle. The truth he'd tried to express had turned into noise. And that was when he started talking about leaving. Not just leaving the band. Leaving the whole thing. The fame, the name, the prison of being Jim Morrison. In early 1970, he told Ray he wanted to stop performing. He wanted to go to Paris and write. Just write. No stages, no cameras, no crowd screaming his name back at him, like it belonged to them instead of him. Ray didn't want to let him go, but he understood, because Ray had seen it happening. He'd watched Jim become a ghost inside his own life. So in March 1970, Jim left Los Angeles. He took Pamela and flew to Paris. He rented an apartment on Rue Beautreillis. He walked the streets. He sat in cafes. He wrote in notebooks that nobody would ever see. He tried to become invisible. And for a while, it almost worked. But something was still unfinished. Something he hadn't said. Something he hadn't released. That's why, one cold November night in 1970, Jim Morrison rented that studio on Rue de Seine. Claude Montand, the engineer, was there early. He'd been told to expect an American musician, but he didn't know who. When Jim walked in, Claude recognized him immediately, not from fame, but from something in his eyes, a heaviness, a knowing. Jim shook his hand, barely smiled, and said, "I just need a few hours, and I need to be alone." Claude nodded. He set up the microphone. He checked the levels, and then Jim said, "Can you step outside too? I'll knock when I'm ready." Claude hesitated, but something in Jim's voice made it clear this wasn't negotiable. So Claude left the room and sat in the hallway. Pamela was already there, sitting on a wooden bench, her coat wrapped around her, her face unreadable. Inside the studio, Jim Morrison stood alone, the microphone in front of him, the tape rolling. No band, no audience, just him and the words he'd carried for so long they'd become part of his bones. Nobody knows exactly what he said that night. Claude only heard pieces through the door, fragments, but he said it sounded like poetry, like prayer, like someone trying to explain their whole life in one breath before the chance disappeared forever. Jim talked about his father, about the distance between them that had started so early and never closed, about what it felt like to reject everything you were supposed to be and still wonder, years later, if you'd made a mistake. He talked about the songs, about how the end wasn't really about death. It was about releasing the parts of yourself you'd been taught to fear. About how every lyric he'd ever written came from the same place, the gap between what people see and what's actually true. He talked about Pamela, about love that felt like drowning and salvation at the same time, about how she was the only person who'd ever seen him without the mask, and how terrifying that was, and how necessary. He talked about fame, about how it gave him everything except the one thing he actually wanted, to be understood, about how the stage had become a trap, about how every night he performed, he felt like he was dying a little, giving pieces of himself to people who didn't want Jim. They wanted the myth. And then, according to Claude, Jim's voice dropped to almost a whisper, and he said something Claude would never forget. "I wanted to be a poet. I became a symbol, and now I don't know how to be human anymore." The recording lasted nearly 2 hours. When it finally stopped, there was silence. Then the door opened. Jim walked out, his face pale, his eyes red. He didn't look at Pamela. He didn't look at Claude. He just walked past them, down the stairs, and out into the Paris night. Claude went back into the studio. The tape was still there, wound tight on the reel. He labeled it carefully. He put it in a case. And he waited for Jim to come back and tell him what to do with it. But Jim never came back. 3 months later, Jim Morrison was found dead in his bathtub on Rue Beautreillis. July 3rd, 1971. He was 27 years old. The official cause was heart failure. No autopsy was performed. Pamela was there. She was the only one. In the chaos that followed, the grief, the questions, the conspiracy theories, the myth-building, the tape from that November night disappeared. Some say Pamela took it. Some say the studio lost it in a move. Some say someone from the Doors' management made sure it was destroyed, because what was on it would have shattered the legend they were trying to preserve. Claude Monton kept quiet for years, but in 1998, in a small French music magazine, he finally told the story. He said he didn't know where the tape was. He said he wished he'd made a copy. But mostly, he said this. Jim Morrison spent his whole life trying to tell people who he really was. And the one time he finally did, alone in that studio, nobody was allowed to hear it. That is the tragedy. Not that he died young, but that he died still trying to be seen. The world remembers Jim Morrison as the wild man, the poet shaman, the rebel king, the voice that screamed and whispered and challenged and seduced. And all of that is true, but it is not the whole truth. The whole truth is that Jim Morrison was a man who wanted to connect, who wanted to be known, who believed that words and music could bridge the distance between people, could make loneliness less lonely, could turn isolation into communion. And when the world turned him into something he wasn't, when fame made connection impossible, he tried one last time to speak the truth. Alone, in a Paris studio, with no one listening. And maybe that's the real lesson. Not that Jim Morrison was a legend, but that he was a human being who struggled with the same things we all struggle with. The fear of being misunderstood, the longing to be truly seen, the ache of carrying something inside that you can't fully express. The songs remain. Riders on the Storm. The End. People Are Strange. Light My Fire. LA Woman. They still move people. They still matter. They still feel true. But somewhere, maybe, that tape still exists. In a box, in an archive, in someone's attic. The recording of a man trying one last time to be heard. Not as Jim Morrison, the icon, but as Jim, the poet, the son, the lover, the human. And if you've ever felt like the world sees you as something you're not, if you've ever felt like you're performing a version of yourself that isn't real, if you've ever wanted to strip everything away and just tell the truth, even if no one's listening, then you already know what Jim Morrison was trying to say that night. You are not alone. You never were.